The House of Drear, Chapter 7. A movement of cool air from the open door fanned springy curls tucked behind Mrs. Small's ears. She'd never seen old Pluto. Her hands clenched as some instinct to defend her family made her stand boldly in front of him. When the loud knocking started, she had moved forward. She stood there, not menacing, but watchful and strong. Pluto stepped over the threshold in a direct but courteous manner. He had thick white hair and a full white beard, just as Mr. Small had described. And he was tall, taller than any elderly man Mrs. Small had ever seen. His broad shoulders drooped forward with age, causing his huge head to seem as untamed as that of a white gerfalcon. What Mr. Small hadn't done was put the whole picture of Pluto together for Mrs. Small. His beard and hair against the dark brown skin of his face, out of which peered glassy green eyes. He was somehow larger than dream or nightmare. She studied him from head to foot and did not think about him being lame. It was something other than his fearful head that caused her face to tighten. The way Mr. Pluto dressed seemed out of place and out of season, although there was no one thing that was wrong. Too well ordered, Mrs. Small thought. Yes, just too well groomed for a countryman. The idea came to her that maybe Mr. Pluto had planned with great care some particular effect. But why, she wondered. She carefully wiped her damp palms on her apron and extended her hand to this stranger. "You are Mr. Pluto." Her voice was uncertain. "I shouldn't stare. My gracious, I was staring at you. I'm awfully sorry." Mr. Pluto walked near and politely took her hand. He wore heavy hide gloves. They looked new, and he did not remove them. He said nothing. He retreated to a place just within the open door where there was least light. "This is Thomas, my son," Mrs. Small said. She turned slightly in Thomas's direction, where he still lay half beneath the kitchen table. There was an awkward silence in which Mrs. Small tried not to notice the mess Thomas had made, for it was Thomas alone who had caused the dishes to crash down upon his head. Mrs. Small slowly freed herself from the shock of Mr. Pluto, and, in the silence of the kitchen, she understood clearly what must have befallen her son. Quickly, Mrs. Small spoke again. "And this is my husband. I believe you two already know one another." Looking at Pluto, her features tensed. Her eyes darkened as though shadow passed over her vision. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Small," Pluto said. He was boldly cordial. "I'm afraid I mistook your boy." He cleared his throat. Thomas, still shivering, watched Mr. Pluto secretly from beneath his arm. "There are strangers, every once in a while," Pluto said darkly. "They come out here and they mean no good. I chase 'em off. I thought your boy was one." He nodded at Thomas by way of apology. His eyes flicked toward Mr. Small and quickly away before they could make contact. He did this several times. Now why is he shifty? Thomas wondered. And he's a speech maker, but why doesn't he seem to know his speech? Or else he hasn't written all of it yet. Thomas shot a glance at his father. He couldn't have been more surprised by the look on his face. Mr. Small stood stock still in a pose of deep concentration. His arms were rigid at his side. He stared so hard at old Pluto, his whole face seemed caught in a terrible spasm. Thomas whistled silently through his teeth. Secretly, he looked at old Pluto to see if he had noticed. But Pluto was staring into some neutral space above the table, as if waiting agreeably for what was to come next. Thomas had another look at his father, only to find him his usual self. Whatever had caused him to become upset no longer showed in his expression, nor in the way he stood there. And I'm going to stop. As a reader, I've noticed just a couple changes in here. On the previous page, or actually at the beginning of the chapter on page 73 and then on into 74, we had a change in point of view. And I want you to think about what that change of point of view was. And also, I feel like we have a contrast and contradiction with Mr. Small's behavior and the way he's acting towards Mr. Pluto. "Was I seeing things?" Thomas asked himself. "Nice to see you again, Mr. Small," he said. He picked up his pipe and walked around the table to shake hands with Mr. Pluto. "I want to thank you for taking care of things. You did well putting the rooms in order. Saves me a lot of time and energy. You'll work yourself too hard, though." "Why, the big moving van came at the beginning of the week. I took my time," said Pluto. "I hope it's all right." "Couldn't be better," said Mr. Small. "Everything is fine just the way you arranged it." He watched Pluto as though he had been struck suddenly by some new and strange idea of him. Again, Pluto would not meet his eyes, but appeared to pull back from him as far as he could without moving physically. Mr. Small took a step toward Pluto and shifted the conversation without warning. "How's the black doing, and the bay?" he said matter-of-factly. "I remember you were working on their shoes." The question startled Pluto. There was no place for him to back up to without going out the door. "Oh," he stammered. Mr. Small took another step forward. Yes, sir." "The bay is fine, just fine." Pluto was talking fast, and Mr. Small did not move. "But I had to hobble that black," Pluto said. "He's got the chill, but he won't stay still. He tries to run all night to get away from it. I had to hobble him, had to tie his feet to keep him from bursting his heart." "Horses, horses," said Thomas. "Papa, horses?" He was on his feet, forgetting his fear of Pluto. He thought of Pesty and that Darrow boy, and the black horse they had with them. "Mr. Pluto has 3 horses, son," said Mr. Small. "I told you he uses 2 at a time for the buggy he gets around in. At night he keeps them in the cave on the other side of the hill from here. The black has simple fever, which is odd, isn't it, Mr. Pluto, in a horse of such dark color? I thought simple fever hit horses with lighter coats, such as the whites and the grays." "Yes, well," Mr. Pluto thought for a while. He seemed to struggle with his memory, and Thomas watched him. Indeed, they all watched him, as though he were not just strange, someone they'd only heard of, but a man beyond their knowledge. "If it was just a heat problem," Mr. Pluto began, "say heat like they have in India, it wouldn't have hurt the black. It wasn't the heat, though. It was nervous shock." "I had no idea nervousness could act on a horse's heat centers," Mr. Small said. He had taken another step forward, and Pluto became agitated. "Not nervousness," Pluto said. He squeezed his gloved hands together. "Nervous shock. Nervous shock by haunted things nothing living should have the unhappiness to see." At once, Thomas had a vision of night and Mr. Pluto's black horse grazing the hillside. A specter floated slowly nearer until it was beside the horse. The horse lifted his head, standing there for a second before falling with a thud to the ground. "Papa, ghosts," Thomas whispered. "He's talking about ghosts." Mr. Small looked sternly at Thomas. After that, Thomas stayed quiet. Then Mr. Small looked hard at Pluto. At that moment, Thomas saw the faintest trace of amusement on Pluto's face. His father didn't seem to notice it. "You have a sick quarter horse on your hands," said Mr. Small. "This is a lonely stretch of country. I'm sure the town boys like fooling around along the stream. Thomas, didn't you tell us you met 2 children out here today? One of them was a little girl called Pesty. She was riding a black horse, Mr. Pluto, and I believe she left the impression the horse belonged to you." They all stood still in the room, with the quiet slowly closing in on them. Mr. Small's meaning had been clear to Mrs. Small and clear to Thomas. But if he had meant to startle Mr. Pluto with his knowledge of an unhobbled, seemingly well horse, he had been mistaken. When Pluto started speaking, he didn't even bother to lift his voice above the hostile silence. He seemed not to consider that Mr. Small had raised the possibility he might be lying. Now he kept his eyes on Mr. Small's feet, moving steadily forward. "That Pesty," Mr. Pluto said, fondly, it seemed to Thomas. "She can do more with a wild animal than any small child should be able to do with anything." "You mean to say a child could unhobble a full-grown quarter horse suffering from simple fever?" Mr. Small's voice was angry now. "No," said Mr. Pluto quietly. "No, I mean to say that Pesty can ride that black any time at all, as long as it's day.